Welcome to Rite Gud, the podcast that helps you write good. I'm Benedict. In this episode, we're talking about originality. Most writers strive for originality, and many readers complain when a plot or character is unoriginal. But how important is it, really? Some of our most popular and profitable media properties today are wildly unoriginal. Reboots, remakes, sequels, homages, or just stories very similar to things we've seen before. Here to talk to us about this is Stephen Mazur, assistant editor at the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction. Hi, Stephen. Tell us about yourself.
Hi, RS. Great to be here. Yes, I am an assistant editor at the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction. I've been doing that for nearly 10 years. I took over for John Joseph Adams just as he was getting ready to leave to embark on his big career as an anthologist.
Now, are you a published writer, or?
No, I guess, they say that all editors are really just frustrated writers. I've tried to write a few times. I took a couple of classes in college, and I don't mind it, but, something that I've read and heard writers say that one of the things that I do for the magazine is I interview the writers that we publish, and
Right.
One of the stock questions that I like to ask is, why do you like to write? So, and usually they tend to give an answer that's some riff on something that science fiction writer David Gerald once said, which is that I wasn't seeing the types of stories that I wanted to read, so I decided to write them myself.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I've never felt that, because to me, there's so much to read that there's more than I can read in, probably 3 lifetimes. So I feel like I don't really have a story to tell, and even if I did, that would, that would take time away from reading all this great stuff out there.
Huh, I see. Yeah, because I think that was my answer to the question, too.
Oh yeah, a lot of writers say that.
What part do you play in choosing the stories that run in the magazine? Do you comb through the slush pile yourself, or?
Sort of. I used to. That was my primary job until Charlie Finley took over as editor. So for about 5 years, I was the slush reader for the magazine. So, back in those days, until Charlie became editor, we still got all of our submissions through the mail.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, oh, yeah. Actually,
that's a long time ago.
In certain ways, I kind of I still miss it. It was nice just having the stories on paper, just right in front of you, easy to deal with. Although having them online has its own advantages. But my boss, Gordon Van Gelder, the publisher of FNSF, he was also the editor at that time, so we'd get the mail in. He would look through the envelopes, pick out the names of the people that he knew or that he'd published already that he felt like he should look at, and I would get everything else, and it was my job to open up the mail and start reading. So, I would reject stories or pass them along to Gordon if I thought they were good or if they excited me or if I thought it was something that he would enjoy. We have another assistant editor Lisa Rogers, who mostly does copy editing, but she would also read slush when she was on her day. She still works for us remotely. I think she's out in Oregon doing postdoctoral work.
Oh, wow.
I forget what on. But yeah, so that was my job. It was a great job. I think I had 19 stories that I picked out of the slush and sent to Gordon, and he published those, which I think is a pretty good track record because, we were pretty choosy.
Yeah.
That included Callie Wallace's first published story. It was something called Botanical Exercises for Curious Girls, and she's gone on to publish 4 or 5 novels. And I also found, it's incorrect to say found, because somebody would have would have
Yeah.
published it
I
anyway.
discovered it.
Yes, I just...
Me.
Really what I'm saying is I just happened to be there the day that the story came in the mail, but I did read and send up to Gordon Alyssa Wong's first story, The Fisher Queen, that
Nice.
it was cool. That got nominated for some awards, so that's fun. I like being able to, it's just a fun little feather in my cap. Well, so Charlie's been the editor for, I guess, about 4 years now. He looks at all the submissions. We get them in through the Moksha submission portal. Charlie looks at everything. We have some additional first readers whose job it is to read through everything in the submission pile, and they'll leave opinions on it because that's something the system allows us to do.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, it's cool. And then Charlie will come through and also read it. So now I don't deal with slush the same way that I used to, but I do. I give Charlie second opinions on stories that he wants second opinions on. I'm thinking of buying this. Can you tell me what you think? And I also have free reign to basically just read whatever I want in the submission pile. So I get
That's
to
neat.
pick and choose. It's fun.
Neat. And you guys are really good about getting back to people, at least with rejections, really quickly, which is something I appreciate. It's very hard when you send out a story and you wait like 6 months and get a generic rejection letter. You guys are just like, if you're not going to take it, then usually within a week or two, it's just like, nope, sorry, and that's it.
Well,
It's pretty nice.
Thank you. Yes, Charlie and Gordon before him. It's important to be quick, and we try to be as quick as we can.
Yeah. And that is probably tough because I understand your magazine gets a lot of submissions, like a lot. Like how many roughly would you say that you get in an average month?
I checked this pretty recently. We get very nearly 1,000 stories a month.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I think in the year to date we've had almost 12,000.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
That's too many. That's
It's
a lot.
It's
and
a lot
you
to
publish,
read.
I mean, how many of those are you publishing? You have your magazine comes out once every 2 months, and I
Right.
mean, how many are there? Maybe like a dozen stories?
Yeah. Charlie tries to, in each issue, we're trying to have between 10 and 12 stories.
Right.
That's about as many as that makes for the best composition of an issue.
Right.
Too many, and you can't really quite remember what all the, what the best stories were, and too few, and you don't feel like you've gotten enough. So, yeah,
Right.
in a year, we'll get about, almost 12,000 submissions, which I think is about as many as, say, Clark's World will get. They also get a lot.
Yeah.
So about 1,000 stories a month, about almost 12,000 a year, and we'll publish somewhere between 60 and 70 stories a year. But I think really for the past 4 or 5 years, it's really been more like somewhere between 60 and 65 stories.
Wow.
Yeah, I do the math every now and again because I've been on a few panels at conventions that it's all about ask the editors stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So they want to know. So our acceptance rate is 0.6%.
Yeah, that is a steep ratio. Holy cow.
Yeah.
So I am guessing in order to be one of those 65 out of 12,000, you got to stand out a lot.
Yes, you do have to stand out if you're going to get published in FMSF.
Yeah. Now, how important is originality in concept and characterization and in plot structure when it comes to making that decision regarding what you accept and what you reject?
I'd say it's important. It's an art, not a science. Sometimes it can come down to feel. I'd say there are gradations of... Right, yeah, gradations. So, some of the stuff that we publish, it's more traditional. Something along the lines of Gregor Hartman's work. It's more along the lines of, traditional future outer space science fiction. Or if you think of Matthew Hughes's fantasy stories.
Right.
They're great reads, but he's very clearly and deliberately working in the tradition of Jack Vance, Far Future Dying Earth, where magic is indistinguishable from science, right? So those stories are fun, but it's not exactly breaking new science fictional ground, even though they're worth publishing and they're certainly worth reading. So there's that side of it where in those cases the originality I guess is more on the margins. I mean, like Gregor Hartman is doing good work and it's fun reads, but I would definitely say that originality is definitely important when you're looking at as many stories as we are. The stories that you've published in our magazine, and I'm also thinking of G.V. Anderson's first story that we published, I Am Not I. That was 2 summers ago. And I would say from about a year ago, Shooting Iron by Cassandra Caw and Jonathan Howard.
Oh, that was a neat one.
Yeah, it was, right? Yeah, we can talk about that more.
In a little bit, I think we're going to talk about remixing tropes.
Yes.
And I think that's something that story does beautifully.
Yeah, it's cool. Like these are all great examples of what I at least would consider original work. At FNSF, we're always ready to be surprised. We always want to see something that we haven't seen before, and I guess it's just a matter of how original is going to be. It can be original at the margins. It can be something we've like really never seen before.
Right.
But in that, I guess I would just say, because I guess we'll get into it more in a little bit, but I would say in originality in today's science fiction market, character is very important if you want your work to feel original, because it's tough to do it in plot nowadays because just so many stories have been written already.
And there's a limited number of ways to combine the elements that make up a plot. I mean, we have been telling stories for a very, very long time, and there's only so many types of endings you can really do.
Yeah.
Anything you've done has been done before, probably. Also with sci-fi or speculative fiction, well, it'd be kind of nuts to say like, oh, somebody else already did a robot story one time. We're never publishing robot stories again.
Right.
Because that's unoriginal. We already had a robot story once several years ago. No more. Someone already did a robot story. I mean, so just pure 100%, oh my God, I've never seen this before. That's not a realistic goal. And probably not a thing you should do, because to say like, oh, no one can ever write about this again because somebody else did a couple of years ago is ridiculous. And you're going to miss out on some pretty awesome stories.
Well, it all depends. Gordon would joke to me every once in a while that early on when he was editing the magazine, he wished that he just had like a little card that he could have printed up so that he could send it out as a rejection saying that basically just said Damon Knight did this idea 40 years ago and he did it better.
Right.
But I guess that's more of that speaks more to how good of a writer Damon Knight was than anything else.
Right.
Or that he had the fortune of being born earlier than the rest of us. So we got to it first.
Absolutely. I mean, we're coming on after decades of so much sci-fi, so much fantasy, so much horror being written, and I'm sure back in the 1930s, like, you wrote about robots, it was like, oh my God, a mechanical man? That's amazing. Now it's not really impressive. We've had 100 years of people doing robot stories, so to like stand out as with your robot story, it's got to be a really special robot story.
Yeah.
It's like, how can I be different? How can I set myself up? How can I set myself apart from 100 years of work? That's really hard. That's really hard. But that being said, among your submissions, do you see certain plots or stock characters or tropes used like way, way, way too often? Like, I'm guessing things come and go in trends. I know there was a huge zombie trend in the early 2000s. And I'm guessing that in the 90s, post Anne Rice, there was a huge, like, horny vampire story trend, probably. Is there a current trend of tropes or stories or creatures or whatever that you just see overwhelmingly right now? Like, are there stories or tropes that you guys are getting just too much of right now?
Yeah, yeah, there is. And the zombie trend, I think that came back at the end of the last decade, because when I started the magazine, we were right in the middle of that again.
Oh, probably because of The Walking Dead, I bet.
Yeah, The Walking Dead and John Adams, he either started or caught on at the right time, the new zombie craze, because he had that big, oh, I forget what it's called now, but he had his two big zombie anthologies, and the first one especially was a real big hit back in I think 2008.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it did very well. Everybody knows it. Gordon told me once that for years after 9/11, he would get a lot of dead returning to life stories.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So like zombie stories, ghost stories. A lot of the times there wasn't even really a science fiction reason for it. The story would just be, this person's dead, now they're alive again. So, he thought that all had something to do with 9/11 trauma.
I can absolutely see that.
Yeah.
I mean, weren't there a ton of ghost stories after World War One?
I don't know, but I wouldn't be
I think there was
surprised.
like a trend for a lot of haunting. It comes and goes. You can definitely see, oh, this era has a big trend for hauntings, and this era has a big trend for werewolves or vampires or something, and so much of it is just reactions to what's going on in the culture.
Yeah, I mean, I will say that at least as far as ghost stories go, there's always kind of like, I think, a baseline level of those, because there's
Right.
always, some new writer who comes along, or like not even new writer, but just, somebody starts writing and they decide, what shall I write about? I know, I shall write about death. How shall
Right.
I write about death? I know, I'll write a ghost story. Nobody's done that before.
Hey guys, I got this crazy idea. What if a couple who has a young child or are expecting their first child moves into a house that is haunted? You've never seen this before
Yeah.
in your life. I've always wondered why we don't do more ghost renter stories. Like, I could
Oh.
definitely see dealing with a shitty landlord going like, yeah, sorry, you're gonna lose your housing deposit because of the blood coming out of the walls. Like, but it's not mine. Like, well, I'm sorry. Do you know that maybe you brought the ghost in with you? I'm not gonna get an exorcism. I'm not paying for that.
Just taking him to small claims court.
Yeah.
Just the angst of like, I know I can leave, but this haunted apartment is the best that I can afford.
I'm trapped in a lease. I can't afford to break it. I gotta stay here for a year. I can't afford to move.
Yeah. See, that'd be a funny story. I'd like to read
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Or like a haunted Airbnb, like some sort of poltergeist thing. Like, oh, all the doors are locked. We'll break the windows. No, don't. I'll get a bad review.
Yeah.
But
Oh, yeah.
but yeah, so just in the time that I've been here, over the past decade or so, we've seen the petering out of the latest zombie craze. There was an urban fantasy trend for a few years, I want to say from like 2010 to 2012. Like vampires and werewolves in the city, or
Vampires and werewolves. I wonder what that trend is a response to. I
uh,
can't imagine what piece of pop culture that could be coming from.
my pet peeve story. My pet peeve story from that time in work was the werewolf private eye story. It's like somebody loves werewolves and then they happen to go see an old detective movie and they think, ah, yes, the werewolf detective. No one has thought of this before.
Is that really that common a trend? Is like werewolf detectives like a thing you see a lot
Well,
of?
I mean, not anymore, and I definitely saw it a few times.
Wow.
Oh yeah,
I legit did not expect that. I did not. I would not have put werewolf detective together, especially to the point where like, oh, another werewolf detective.
yeah,
Go.
I definitely saw it. I definitely saw it more than once. I mean, I think in a way, Werewolf Detective is just kind of my catch-all for classic supernatural being who is also a detective in the city at night. But yeah, I definitely saw
Oh, I'm
Werewolf.
sure you get a ton of vampire detectives too.
Yeah,
I could see
yeah,
that because it's nighttime. It's noir.
yeah. Luckily, vampires and werewolves that like they've cooled down too. And then there was one year, maybe like 5 years ago now, where it seemed like I was reading a lot of time dilation stories. Yeah,
Huh.
I don't know why. It was just something I noticed after a while. But as far as a current trend, so since the 2016 election, I'm not putting any values on anything, but we have been getting a lot of real downer stories. Lots of horror, dark fantasy, dystopian fiction, apocalypse, post-apocalypse stuff.
Oh yeah, dystopian fiction's really
Oh
big right
yeah,
now.
yeah, huge. And even the stories that we're getting that aren't straight horror, they are horror tinged, dark fantasy, dark science fiction, just a lot of stuff that's really down, stuff that is not upbeat. It's actually been a problem for Charlie and how he wants to compose issues. He's said it to me because I think he said that we've gotten some reader complaints about everything being too bleak all the time. I mean, the stuff that is publishable is often good. I'm not saying that downer stories are bad. A lot of the best
Right.
stories are really down and hard hitting, but it's not all if you're reading an issue of anything really, or
Right. You want a variety a little bit, or I mean, I don't mind a book that's entirely like depression and sadness, but I can see a lot of readers going like, "Oh my God, please give me a happy ending once or twice somewhere in this book."
yeah, it's just not always fun to read downer stuff back to back to back. So I'd say
Right.
that's the trend. Also, this isn't really like magazine specific. It's just a feeling I have of like looking at the wider genre world. So short stories and maybe even books, short stories, maybe even movies. It seems like there's like a little boom going on in time travel fiction, which I mean, I don't know, maybe that fits in with the current political climate that a lot of people are feeling right now too. I was once in the audience at a time travel panel at DragonCon, which was a lot of fun. But one of the panelists, I just remember him saying that time travel fiction is as old as regret. So, well,
Yeah.
with the way things are, I'm sure some people anyway. But just yeah, I think time travel
Oh
fits in
yeah.
with the current dystopian.
Yeah, not to mention just this cultural moment we have where we're really awash in nostalgia,
Yeah,
like hitting it so hard.
yeah. Nostalgia definitely fits in. Stranger Things. Stranger Thing. I mean,
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know if there's time travel in there.
Not so much, but the whole series is all about like, hey, remember the 80s? They were great.
It's funny. I'm too young to really remember the '80s, but I
Yeah.
mean, just too young. But I gotta say, I love that show. But yeah,
Yeah. Oh, it
nostalgia.
is fun.
It's powerful.
Yeah, and I love Glow. I totally
Oh,
love
Glow
Glow
is
and how
so
just
great.
completely ridiculous it is with the hair and the everything. It's fantastic. But in terms of trends, bringing it back to trends, are there any that you've seen so much that you'll just reject them outright? Like, I know Strange Horizons has a list of stories we've seen too often, and then horror stories we've seen too often, and I think the list includes Kid's imaginary friend turns out to be real and evil, and literally anything with zombies in it. To the point where if they get one of those stories, they'll just say, no, nope, nope, sorry, nope.
Yeah, I think Neil Clark also has a list of story types that they're not prohibited, but apparently they'd be a hard sell for him. But for us at FNSF, the answer is no. We don't operate like that. Not in any official kind of way. Sometimes, like 2 years ago, we were talking about this one story that we had on submission. Like it's good, is it good enough? Do we want to publish it? And it was, I forget if it was like a capital G ghost story or if it just had ghosts in it. But I said to Charlie, like, like this is good and all, but it seems that like in the past, over the past 6 or 7 issues, we've published like 9 stories with ghosts in them. So like, do we really need this one? And I think we ended up rejecting it. But but we don't have any official prohibitions. I do know that our Prime first reader, who does a lot of reading for us, has a pet peeve of stories that begin with the protagonist waking up.
Oh, yeah. Oh, those are the worst.
Yeah, but we never reject anything outright just by plot or trope, because, you never know when you'll get, that one story that's, it's such a great example of that trope or subgenre that you just have to have it, or it makes you rethink that trope or subgenre. So,
right, like you might see a heartbreakingly amazing werewolf detective story. You don't know.
I mean, I'm not opposed to them in principle. it was honestly, it was always the way that the writers wrote that story. You could tell that as they were writing it, they were thinking, "Ha, what a great idea! No one's ever thought of this. I'm so original." And here I am reading it, thinking, I've read like 3 of these this month.
Wow.
I mean, like maybe not quite that many, but it was not as original. They were not as original as they thought they were being. So that was my big pet peeve. But I mean, if somebody came up with a good werewolf detective story, then good for them. But yeah, at FNSF, we're trying to be both on the cutting edge, and we also want to cast as wide a net of what we're willing to publish. That's always been sort of our editorial imperative. Our fiction guidelines, they've always said, and they still do, that we have no formula for fiction. I think it's always been our great strength that we don't limit ourselves to a certain style or a certain subgenre.
Right, and that is neat. Actually, you do get a really wide variety of stuff in every issue, which is something I kind of like, because I tend to focus on more like literary horror, literary speculative, and it is kind of nice to see this wide variety of like, here's a hard science fiction story, and here's an adventure fantasy, and here's some other thing. It's like, oh, okay, because it's stuff that I wouldn't normally read.
Yeah.
And it is kind of nice to be able to see that.
Yeah, working at FNSF is really, it's really shaped how I read as well, because when I'm reading short stories, just on my own time, I really need that sense of variety. I can't really read themed anthologies anymore, because, I'll be reading it like a vampire anthology, right? The first story. Boy, that was a great vampire story. Let me go on to the second one, so on and so on. Halfway through the book.
Yeah.
Okay, that was a great vampire story too. What's the next story? Another vampire story?
Yeah.
Damn it! I'll never read another vampire story, and I'm not finishing this book. I've noticed that, like, even some single author collections, by the end of the book, I just start to get tired of that author's voice. Even when the stories that they're writing are, all about, run the gamut from science fiction to fantasy to all these things. Like, I'm thinking of a specific author, but I won't say who, because it really doesn't matter. But by the time I got to the end of his collection, it was a very good collection, but I just got a little tired, because I feel like I could hear his voice, and it was like the same or similar voice that was running through all the stories. And it was not something that I had ever noticed before, just reading his work in various magazines here and there, like, spaced out.
Right.
So, yeah, I think variety is very important, at least for me. It's something, it's just something I need.
Right. Now, I'm going to take a moment to talk about myself shamelessly, because it's my podcast and no one can stop me. When I wrote my English name, I was very proud of myself, because I thought it was a really original story. It's about an imitation human wandering around a foreign country. And then after it was published, a lot of people said, oh, that's kind of like Under the Skin, which I had heard of, but I hadn't seen it. So about a year after that, I went out and I watched the movie, and I was mortified because it is very similar to the story I wrote, beat for beat. And now I was all worried that people are just going to think that, oh, God, she's a plagiarist. She just ripped off Under the Skin. Then when I was working on All of Me, which is about a mermaid, I was real excited because I'm like, oh, no one else is doing like a big mermaid story right now. And midway through my rough draft, I started seeing ads for The Shape of Water, which is another story about a fish person who is being persecuted, and a metaphor for being a social outcast and stuff. So even when you do try to be very original, sometimes it is not possible because, as we've mentioned before, human beings have been telling stories for a very long time, and there's a lot of media out there, and chances are someone has already told your story before. Everything's been done before. Given that, is it possible for a writer or artist to really be original? Like, what makes something different? What makes something special or original?
Well, I mean, what do you think you mean by truly original?
I mean, something that when I'm finished reading it, I go, wow, I haven't seen that before.
Okay. Well then, yeah, I think a writer can do that even today. Plots and settings that get rehashed or riffed on. I mean, you can think of all of, J.R.R. Tolkien's imitators. That's stuff that isn't exactly original.
Right.
Something that is new today, the silk punk subgenre that I think it was. I'm pretty sure it was popularized or maybe even coined by Ken Liu with his big fantasy trilogy that he's in the middle of right now. And now we're seeing more fantasy and science fiction that's either coming directly from Asia or it's got a lot of East Asian influences to it. So, all that's new now, but, who knows? Maybe we'll live to see the day when people start talking about silk punk as a played out subgenre, the same way
Right.
like, oh, all this secondary world Tolkien-esque high fantasy. You can never tell. I think that if you're concerned about being original as a writer, it's tough nowadays to do that in plot. I think about like all those great Twilight Zone twists or
Right.
Frederick Brown short stories from the middle of the last century. He was kind of the O. Henry of science fiction. You ever? I've only actually read one of his stories, but my father-in-law gave me a big book of his from Nesfa Press. He was that writer who I forget if he wrote it or if it's just attributed to him, but that 2-sentence science fiction story, the last man on Earth sat typing at his typewriter in his room. Suddenly there was a knock at the door. Yeah,
Right.
like shorts like that depend on plot twists. Although I have watched a few episodes of Black Mirror, and they do a pretty great job of crazy plot twists from what I can tell, so it is possible. But I think I mentioned this before about character. I think that if you're a writer who's concerned about being original, then what you do is you focus on your characters and you focus on the little details. Science fiction and fantasy, like as defined genres, have been around for a long time, at least 100 years. I mean, you could go back to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. You can probably go back further, Spencer's The Fairy Queen, what have you. So I think until or unless our society morphs into something that's truly unrecognizable, where you could just write about your regular day and it's totally new and there's it's like nothing that has ever happened before in history, then it's going to be tough. So it's depth of character that and all the little details in the story that make a person's work stand out. Most of the time you're going to be original on the margins.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned Mary Shelley's Frankenstein as an example of something that was original, and it was incredibly groundbreaking. A lot of people refer to it as the first sci-fi story. But in a way, I mean, that's not 100% whole cloth. Oh my God, no one's ever seen it before. Like, it's a really big update or a new version, I guess you could say, of these traditional stories about golems.
Oh, I never thought
And
about
in a
that.
way,
Yeah.
right? I mean, there's that whole really long tradition of this idea of in the Kabbalah, like a golem, that's some sort of creature made out of earth that's brought to life through magical means and turns out to be a problem. And I mean, there are stories like that of people, of mortal human beings creating life and it not going super great because we're tampering in God's domain, and that's kind of a no-no. I mean, the thing I guess that made Mary Shelley special was that she's doing this in a scientific way instead of in a magic way.
Yeah.
And also Frankenstein talks instead of just sort of groaning. And
Yeah, it's tough, right? Because even if you can go all the way back to Greek mythology, and they had stories of, of people going down into Hades to bring people back to life, the Orpheus
right.
myth. So I think it's a hang up for people, for writers to worry too much about, trying to be original for originality's sake. Did you ever watch Doug when you were a kid?
Yes,
Do you remember that
I did.
episode where there's like a TV show and somebody on the TV show wears the exact outfit that he always wears with the shorts and the green vest? So then everybody at school starts wearing it.
I think I vaguely remember it.
Yeah. So he gets really upset and he because that was his original thing, and he goes out and tries to be original. So he puts on this weird mishmash of clothes, and then the next week the guy's wearing that exact same mishmash of clothes on TV. So you just have to be yourself as a writer. I was in an audience at a writers panel at FlameCon a few years ago, and Justina Ireland said, I remember her saying something to the effect of, if you're a writer of color, because that's what she was specifically talking about, but if you're a writer of color, you don't have to worry about, is your story original, because so few of us have gotten to tell our own stories that just the fact that you're writing it makes it original. I mean, I do agree that if you've got some kind of different perspective as a writer, whether it's race, gender, class, neurotypicality, or and anything else that I'm forgetting about, bringing that perspective to the story you're trying to tell definitely adds an element of originality. It's something new.
Oh yeah.
As an editor, that's something we noticed at the office. An interesting new wrinkle. So it that definitely helps.
Right.
Another way you can be original, I think anyway, is to run against a well-established trope. There was a story that we ran in the March-April 18 issue. It's called The Harmonic Resonance of Ejiro Anabori by Woltalabi. He's African, if memory serves. I think he's from Nigeria. But this, it's an interesting story just in how it ends. It's about these two kids. There's some big conflict with an oil company that sort of runs the town, and they come in contact with this alien consciousness, and the positive resolution is achieved at the end of the story's conflict by literally uniting the people into a new meta-consciousness. These two kids who come in contact with the aliens, they become connected, the two kids, and then they just they run around touching everybody who's at this big riot, and then all of those people, they all become connected with each other, and so on and so forth. So what was really interesting to me when I read it the first time, and I'm glad that we published it. There's such a long tradition in SF of all this rugged individualism, and government, and the man is bad, and conformity's bad, and I'm gonna go off and do my own thing. I mean, not even in SF too. I feel like a lot of mainstream literature in the 20th century was like that too.
Western culture especially is very hyper individualistic.
Right, yeah. And this story flies in the face of it. Like, it says that no, the way to create a better society that's free and peaceful and free of conflict is for us all to unite, literally to unite. That, individualism...
Oh, that's really
yeah, that
interesting.
individualism is the source of evil in the world. It keeps us from, understanding one another.
Yeah, because that's almost like the happy version of, like, the Borg.
Well, yeah, that's what I'm going to say.
It's the story of the Borg as written by the Borg, who are like, assimilate
yeah,
rules.
Exactly.
You get to see a billion different pairs of eyes at the same time. This rocks, dude. It's awesome.
I know. It's the story of the Borg is good, and hey, who wouldn't want to be assimilated, man? I mean, look at all this great stuff. It's funny.
Yeah, you get tubes. You get tubes. You don't die. Like, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's funny, right? Because I actually kind of disagree, like, on a deep level with what Talabi seems to be saying in his story. I mean, I find it faintly horrifying, but it's still a neat concept and a good story. And it turns, like, a century of traditional SF, right on its head. So, running against tropes is a great way to stand out, and also to just produce good art, I guess.
Yeah. Speaking of breathing new life into an old trope, let's get back to talking about Shooting Iron. I think that's a fantastic example of a story that takes these really old, overused tropes and does something really new with it.
Yeah, in Cassandra Caw and Jonathan Howard, I think they've said publicly on the internet or in various interviews that the genesis of the story was, I guess, all those old 70s kung fu movies where, like, some white guy from America goes to Asia and he learns how to kung fu better than, all the people there who, like, that's their martial art and it's what they've been doing for a long time.
Even the new Batman Begins.
Oh, yeah.
Like, he kind of learns to be Batman at a monastery in some vaguely Asian place, I think.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Batman, kind of. I like Batman, so...
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right, yeah, he does.
But it is a trope that is used a lot. Like, a white person goes to some place ethnic and learns how to do magic fighting and then goes back to America and he kicks everybody's ass and he's super cool.
With all these Eastern martial arts. So they thought, like, well, what if we wrote a story where, somebody Asian learns how to do a Western martial art way better than, any of the Western people. So it's about, I forget precisely what country she comes from in the story, but, it's about this Asian girl who learns how to be a better gunslinger, that, she's the fastest draw in the West. It's a cool story, and it's got, like, magic guns and, ancient evils. It's a lot of fun. A lot of blood and guts. It's a good, fun story. That character, I think, that character's got legs. They could come back to that.
Now, we've talked about how sort of remixing old tropes, maybe changing perspective, changing setting, can kind of breathe new life into an old story. Is there a risk of getting kind of gimmicky? Like, there's a big cliche about how college theater productions of Shakespeare, they never just adapt it straight up. They always put it like, oh, let's put Macbeth, but it's in a modern corporation. Or let's do King Lear, but it's about the president. Or what if we did Hamlet, but we set it in a 1980s jazzercise studio? And so on and so forth. Is there, like, a risk of getting super gimmicky? And how do you know when you're just using a cheap gimmick that's not going to impress anybody?
I'm not exactly sure about that. I guess it's just a matter of trying to read widely so that, getting back to werewolf detectives, that, you don't mistakenly think that, the thing that you've come up with is so new when maybe it isn't. I think it also kind of just depends on what kind of story you want to tell. If you can make something entertaining, it can be generic. I guess it just depends on what you want to write, what kind of career you want to try and have. I mean, Hamlet in a jazzercise studio might be funny. I don't know.
Could be. I think you did kind of get at something earlier when you were talking about werewolf detectives, that the issue for you was writers were writing it like, holy shit, you've never seen this before. Am I blowing your mind? Like, maybe just write assuming that you're not going to blow anyone's mind with your original premise. Maybe just focus instead of like, whoa, I got this totally crazy new idea that no one's seen anymore. Assume someone's probably done it already, but just focus on like, okay, I'm going to write a really fucking good werewolf detective story. I'm going to really use this premise deeply and get at the heart of what does it mean to be a werewolf detective, and by extension, what does it mean about the human condition?
Yeah, yeah. I guess. Yeah, I guess with what you're saying, I mean, you can do one of two things to, I guess, keep it from being gimmicky. One, you can be funny, and then it won't matter. Or two, with what you were saying, you write with a sense of sincerity. Just like just playing straight with everything, and don't get wrapped up in how great you are, because like you said, somebody's probably thought about it already.
Yeah, over the course of the entirety of human history and culture, someone's probably done a werewolf detective before. Probably in like some Sumerian tablets, someone cuneiformed a werewolf detective story or some kind of equivalent. I don't know. All right. Now, it's easy to say writers should try to be original and strive for originality, but it's very easier said than done. Do you think there's a way to sort of learn how to do that? A way to train yourself to avoid sort of derivative work and cliche work?
Yeah, just try and read more. Try and get out there and live. There was a movie. Oh, it was Midnight in Paris, that Woody Allen movie with Owen Wilson in it, where he, like, spoiler alert, he sort of magically goes back in time at night, to Paris in the 20s, and he meets Ernest Hemingway, and at one point Hemingway says to him, you're a writer, make an observation. So, just try and get out there, see what life is like, make observations. A general trope, something like the hero's journey, or Eat, Pray, Love, middle-aged woman learns to live her best life. That's always kind of going to be around, but the context of our society, it's always changing at some point. So, maybe Eat, Pray, Love in 2119 is a much different story than Eat, Pray, Love in 2019. Same thing with the hero's journey. You can always. I like to read a lot of old science fiction. And, I mean, other things aside, one of the interesting things about it is, even if it's, something that's set in the year 2500, obviously they bring a lot of what life was like in, say, like 1960 or 1970. So,
right.
Just reading it for that and seeing, like, wow, things sure were different back then. Like, that makes for an interesting reading experience. And, like I said before, if you're well read in the genre, you can be original by playing with subverting and answering established tropes, and that'll give you something to write about. Have you ever read We Who Are About To by Joanna Russ?
I don't think so.
Oh, that's a great little novella. I think Wesleyan University Press has an edition of it. Great story. I won't go into the story except just to say that it's really answering and providing a critique of, all of those old stories from the 50s and the 60s where, we've crash landed on this barren planet. We must rebuild civilization. And then they get down to doing it. And this story by Joanna Russ, We Who Are About To, just looks at that and says, like, that is insane. So, that it's a great story. So, that's one example of how you can run against tropes. Or Ursula Le Guin's Earthsea books I've read, like that was, her writing a response to, a lot of Eurocentric fantasy at the time. It's set in a big archipelago instead of some blobby continent, and the people are copper-skinned instead of white. In fact, the general villains, the Kargat people, they're white and blonde. I would also say that reading inside the genre is also helpful to writers of mimetic fiction. If you have any listeners who write straight literature, I've seen plenty of books in the bookstore that are published by like big literary imprints like Knopf or Crown, for example, and the book is mostly literature, but maybe it's got a vampire in it, or there's a little bit of time travel, and the book jacket acts like this writer, hey, nobody's ever put a vampire in a book before. Wow, this is so new. Yeah.
When literary
Yeah.
snobs, when literary fiction snobs do a little bit of dabbling in speculative, you find they just hit all of the cliches
All the
immediately.
cliches, slumming, I'm sure they would call it. But yes, they hit all the cliches
Yeah,
that they don't even know are cliches because they don't read.
because
Yeah,
they
because they
don't
don't
read
read. But
it. It's kind of like when a restaurant like gentrifies street food. Like when they're like, we're making this expensive truffle hot dog or whatever. And you're like, okay, but it's a hot dog. You just put a truffle on it. And you're charging $70 for it. What are you
right,
doing?
yeah,
Like I've seen that, like a serious literary fiction person who's like, you know what, I'm gonna dabble in won't it be fun? I'll do a horror story. I'm going to write a ghost novel, and it's about the fucking couple with the young kid moving into a suspiciously cheap
right,
house.
yeah,
And the walls do the go away thing, and it's like, really?
yeah. But
Really?
I guess what I'm getting at is, well, hey, it sells because we see those books all the time, and it's
Yeah.
new. It must be new to the writer. It's probably new to the staff at that literary imprint, and it's definitely new to the crowd of people who only read quote unquote serious fiction instead of genre fiction.
Right.
So, to all you mimetic fiction people out there, you might as well read some George R. R. Martin or some, I don't know, Conan the Barbarian, Ursula Le Guin,
Yeah.
N.K. Jemisin, and pick up a couple of ideas that you can use to sell your straight lit book, because then it'll be edgy, because there'll be a little bit of genre in it. How exciting.
Yeah, gosh, it kind of blows my mind a little bit when I see that, because you do see it a
Yeah.
bit, and
Yeah, every now and then.
I have a lot of feelings about that. I'm not even sure where to begin.
Yeah.
But it just does strike me as that sort of, I know I used the word before, but gentrification, when like a rich, affluent, especially like predominantly white restaurant owner finds out about some food that tends to be used in like cheap, low income ethnic cooking, and kind of acts like, oh, look at us, we're making this. We made pork cracklins, or oh, we made. It's a big thing in the Northeast to do like really shitty soul food, and be like, oh, look, we made this upscale shrimp and grits. It's like, all right, you're charging like $20 for this thing that was invented by people who had very limited resources and were trying to nourish themselves based on like what was available, and you're acting like you're incredibly brave for making something that you can get for like super cheap someplace else. And there's something about it that leaves like a weird feeling with me that I'm not sure I can totally articulate it, but and they end up doing it rather poorly and in kind of a bland way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which isn't to say that like literary writers should never use genre tropes, because I am totally in favor of like more of a blending between the genre camp and the literary camp. I think it could be good for all of us, and that this distinction is a little bit artificial. Like Kafka to me is a genre
Right. Yeah.
writer in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
He's a fantasy writer. I mean, he doesn't follow adventure fantasy tropes, but the Metamorphosis is a fantasy story.
Yeah. And Beloved, technically a ghost story.
Oh,
Great
yeah.
book.
And a startlingly original
Right.
one, too. And it's not like, oh, we moved into a house that's haunted. Like, it uses this tradition of ghost stories and does something really, really amazing with it. Kurt Vonnegut,
Oh,
too. I
yeah.
think he
Slaughterhouse
remixes
5.
a lot of, like, Golden Age sci-fi into some very, very amazing, startling work. But it's funny when someone, like, who uses genre or writes in genre is very, very good, the literary camp kind of claims them and is like, no, it's not a ghost story.
Yeah.
it's serious literature. Like, no, it's both. And I think Ursula Le Guin was kind of great in that she rejected that. People would say, like, oh, that's not a sci-fi story. Like, she'd say, yeah, it is.
Yeah, it was very good of her to do that. Other people might have just been like, oh, thank God, I'm one of you now.
Yeah. Like, I think Kurt Vonnegut felt uncomfortable about being referred to as a sci-fi writer because a lot of people looked down
Well,
on
I
that.
mean, it definitely hurt sales. The science fiction writers from the 50s and the 60s and even into the 70s, it was kind of a literary ghetto. They didn't get much mainstream attention except for, three or maybe four guys. Heinlein, Bradbury was a big one, Asimov,
Right.
Arthur Clarke. But I don't mind that those literary books that rip off a genre element exist, because science fiction isn't quite for everybody, and they must sell because
Yeah.
they keep doing them. I always think like, oh, if you thought that was a time travel book, like, oh my God, look at all these other books. I wanna show you now. Like, those are the real time travel books.
Right.
I think you could also,
Yeah.
for writers who write in the genre, reading outside of the genre, very important. I've read that Gene Wolfe was a very well-read person outside of strict genre parameters. I mean, he was very well-read within genre as well, but he read a lot of
Right.
Greek mythology.
Oh, you absolutely have to go outside of whatever genre you're
Yeah,
writing in.
it just
Like,
gives you more breadth
yeah.
to draw on your own work.
And I mean, if you're writing adventure fantasy and all you read is Tolkien, then everything you write's just going to look like a really crappy, watered down Tolkien.
Yeah, I know somebody who writes fantasy, and it just reads to me like if you just took all your big fat fantasy books from when you were a kid and a teenager, and you put them in a blender, and then you just poured that back out onto the page, and that's what it reads like, because I think that's all that my friend really reads. So yeah, try and read widely.
Yeah. I mean, that's a thing we definitely talk about on this podcast a lot. Like, please read a lot of stuff. Please don't just read YA. Don't just read Harry Potter and then go, I'm going to write after reading nothing but Harry Potter. Like, oh. Oh, God.
It's funny. I sometimes wonder how many young people still read Harry Potter.
Yeah.
Like I have a work colleague who has a daughter who just turned 13, and I don't think she's read it, and I had already read like 3 of them by that point. It seems to me that the only people who I ever hear talking about Harry Potter are all in their mid-20s to late 30s.
Oh, yeah.
So I don't know. Maybe it won't age quite as well as we all think it will.
Yeah.
There's no
or
way
maybe
to know.
kids will grow up with a different thing, that whatever the next big thing's going to be, that's what they'll be into.
Yeah, or maybe they won't even read anymore. But well, that's
Maybe
just
not.
me being an old man.
Yeah. Kids these days.
Yeah, get off my lawn.
All right. Now, given our present media landscape of reboots, long-awaited sequels, prequels, 80s, 90s nostalgia, do you think there's an incentive financially not to be original? Like, we're getting the second Watchmen adaptation in 10 years. We reboot Spider-Man once a week. Studios are funding and promoting stuff that we've already seen before a million times because it's safe in terms of profit. People are going to spend money on something that feels like, oh, I like Spider-Man. That's Spider-Man. I'll spend my money on Spider-Man because I have limited money right now and I don't want to take a gamble on something that might suck. And audiences don't really seem to mind so much. So this is a question I ask myself. Why bother? Why does it matter? Should I just give up and write Spider-Man? Why do I try so hard to do something new?
I mean, you could try and go into comic books. Rachel Pollack did what I have heard is a very well-respected stint on Doom Patrol back in the 90s, and I feel like there are some more recent genre writers who've just been doing comic book work that I can't remember what it is now, but that's definitely a thing. But I don't really know much about comics. And I do think there's an incentive not to be original. What you were saying about profit from the studio's point of view. Audiences just aren't as captive as they used to be. I mean, you think of the movies, prequels and reboots and sequels are a safe bet because people don't go to the movies like they used to because, we don't have to anymore. We've got our computers, we've got our smartphones. There's just a lot more choice out there to waste your time on. And I don't really read self-published books, but I have heard that the world of online self-publishing in science fiction is really like middle-of-the-road, center-of-the-field stuff. Like, it's not really all that groundbreaking, and I don't know why that is. I guess that's just what sells, so people do it.
Well, there was a werewolf romance series that was very popular on Amazon Kindle for a while. No, I'm sorry. It wasn't werewolf. It was Bigfoot.
Oh.
It was a series of erotic Bigfoot romance novels that made
I've
the
heard
author
of
a
that.
very rich woman.
Yeah, I've also heard that like there are these two women who write like dinosaur porn.
Right. Speaking of self-publishing and that whole thing, this might be a controversial subject, but let's talk about a type of writing that is proudly and cheerfully derivative, fan fiction. Do you think it encourages originality by getting people to do new things with pre-existing characters, pre-existing properties? Or do you think maybe it could stifle originality by letting writers just stick to stuff that's already familiar?
Personally, I'm not a fan. I don't read fan fiction. But, there is that representation aspect to it. I'm thinking of, like, all that slash fiction between Kirk and Spock, right?
Right.
So that filled a need, I guess, back in the days when it was tough to find gay and lesbian representation, and maybe still today. There are all kinds of representation issues that fan fiction can fill. I know that people like it for that reason. But I think Naomi Novik is a pretty big proponent of fan fiction. She has her Temeraire series of Napoleonic fantasy with dragons, and she wrote Uprooted and Spinning Silver. I'm pretty sure that she started out writing fan fiction. It can give you the space and the tools to work on your craft as a writer without having to make up characters and settings from whole cloth. I guess I choose to think of it as apprentice work to do it, if you want to think of it that way. But, of course, people do it for fun and just because they like it. I guess something that's kind of in that vein that I'm reminded of, I've heard that Robert Silverberg, when he was starting out as a writer, he used to make money by writing porn novels when he was in his early career.
I've heard a lot of writers have done that,
Yeah.
including some like really serious literary giants of the mid-20th century. It's just that people pay for that, so...
Yeah, everybody's got to eat, and if that's what they want, that's pay. That's paying work.
Yep.
Yeah, but so apparently Silverberg had like several stock sex scenes that he would just insert into the narrative at the appropriate moments, and he would and he would use the rest of the book as space for him to work things out that he was working on as a writer, or plot structure, or how to do good dialogue. That's part of how he got better as a writer. So I have heard.
Oh, that's kind of fun. That's kind of funny.
Yeah.
Good for him, man.
Right, because if it's a porn novel, what are you really reading it for? So
Right. You're going to skim that other stuff,
Yes.
probably. You're not super concerned about, what's the central conflict of this story?
Yes, pay no attention to me while I work on expressing theme.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then, if you think about fan fiction in like a more professional way, at least in terms of the money, I mean, Star Trek and Star Wars books, and all those Spider-Man books and X-Men novels from the 90s when I was a kid, the D&D books that you could buy from Wizards of the Coast when they still had stores in the mall. People make careers out of this.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Fonda McIntyre, who she won a Nebula and a Hugo for Dreamsnake. She wrote a Star Wars book. It was called The Crystal Star. That was actually the first real book that I ever read. I was like 9. Lots of lots of people. It's definitely a thing you can do, playing with other people's characters, other people's properties. Like I said, it's not really my thing, but
Right.
it is what it is. Definitely something you can use as a writer if you choose to.
All right. Now, let's talk about something that you brought up, market forces. A lot of readers think that writing kind of comes down from the muse, but trends, and not just in terms of plot tropes, but in stuff like, are trilogies in right now? Is there a market for novellas right now? A lot of these things can really affect a writer's career, and I imagine that that influences what you put out there. Would you like to talk a little bit about this and how much market forces just shape what people create?
Yeah, I this is something that I've been thinking about just on and off for the past couple of years. I feel like most writers, other than what you were saying of oh, it's trilogies, everything's got to be a trilogy, right? But other than that, I feel like writers don't really think about, or at least talk about publicly, how market forces beyond the genre and even beyond the publishing industry can impact your career. Most people, I feel like people think that you look at Lord of the Rings and you look at Philip K. Dick's novels and or Dune, Lord of the Rings and Dune. These authors are all dead. These books were written a long time ago, but they're still there in the bookstore because they're great and lots of people like them. So, I feel like the default thinking is that, if you're a great writer, if you can write a great book, you'll be around for a long time, you'll have a great career, and your work will last. But I feel like there's a lot more to it than that.
Oh, yeah.
Like I always see, not so much anymore, but I feel like over the past 10 years, I saw a lot of writers, like newer up-and-coming writers, sort of like complaining about more established writers or, writers who were dead and, complaining about like, all their books are still on the shelf at Barnes & Noble and, they're crowding us all out. There's no room for us to come along. Oh, those terrible old writers, it's all their fault. And I just remember one day I went to the Barnes & Noble in Clifton, New Jersey, which somebody that I know who works at like Barnes & Noble corporate mentioned one time that store is the flagship store for New Jersey. I am from New Jersey. Please don't nobody come get me. But anyway, so I was in there, and I went over to the science fiction section, and I was just kind of looking around, and I just kind of realized, like, I looked at the science fiction section, and then I looked at the general lit section, and the general lit section was like 3 or 4 times bigger than the SF section, and the mystery section was just as big as the general fiction section, and then right next to the science fiction section was the graphic novel and manga section, which was just as big as the adult SF section, and there wasn't even a manga and graphic novel section that I can recall anyway from when I was a kid. So going back like 20 years, and that doesn't even say anything about the dedicated YA section that most stores have, which is also huge. So I feel like a lot of times writers complain about other writers, but just look around at the bookstore, like the whole genre that you're writing in is being squeezed by these other bigger forces that we have no control over. And I have to imagine that Barnes & Noble is pretty sensitive to what sells and what doesn't sell. So obviously people must want YA and graphic novels and mysteries. So I just kind of feel like to say like, oh, this author or that author or this person from another time period is like killing my career. Like I feel like it has very little to do with them. There's only, I just feel that these things impact the context of how writers are trying to have their careers. I've got another example. So if you want to think about Philip K. Dick, right?
Right.
Everybody likes to talk about how Philip K. Dick is one of the greatest science fiction writers of all time. You know, a lot of his books are still in print on the shelf. He's known, and like, you know, I do like the work of his. I'm not saying that he isn't great. I'm just saying that, like, people think that that's just because of the work itself. But this is something, again, I wish this was my own idea, but Gordon told me this once. He said one time, I always remembered this, if you went back in a time machine to, like, the 1971 Worldcon, and you went to the Hugo presentation, you know, there in the banquet room, you ran in, and you yelled out to the crowd, people, I've come from the future to tell you all that in the year 2019, John Brunner and Brian Aldiss have been forgotten by the science fiction public, and the greatest SF writer is generally thought to be Philip K. Dick. Well, you know, they would have laughed you out of the room. Because in the early 70s, John Brunner and Brian Aldiss were writing respected literary experimental SF books, and they were winning awards for it. And yeah, Philip K. Dick won the Hugo for The Man in the High Castle back in, like, I think 1963, but he was kind of this weird nut who took speed so that he could write books faster, so that he could get more money to fund his speed addiction. You know, he was this weird guy. Pretty much all of his books came out as paperback originals. So, you know, back in those days, books didn't really stay on the shelf that long. Distribution was kind of a problem. So all of his books just kind of came and went. And, you know, he was just this weird, cranky guy, right? But, you know, why don't we remember Aldiss and Brunner the same way that we remember Dick? And, you know, and, like, there are plenty of people in the field who remember Aldiss and Brunner. I just mean in, like, I guess on, like, a larger societal level.
Right. Like, if you ask an average person who is Philip K. Dick, they might know.
Yeah.
Outside of genre people, but, like, I honestly don't recognize either of those names. I don't know who they are.
John Brunner, he won the Hugo in, I want to say, 1969 for a book called Stand on Zanzibar, which I own, but I haven't read yet. I think, like, his thing with some of his books, like that one, and maybe The Jagged Orbit and The Sheep Look Up, he was kind of doing, like, John Dos Passos, but in science fiction. Now I wish I had read John Dos Passos. I haven't, so I couldn't really tell you exactly what that is, but, like, that's what I've heard and read. Like, that was kind of the thing for those books that he was working on. I do hope that people who know more about this don't come for me to kill me, because as a personal pet peeve of mine is somebody talking in public about something that they aren't an expert on. I do apologize. But
you're a fake geek.
Yeah, I know, right? But anyway, like, the reason that Philip K. Dick is remembered as well as he is, and his books are still in print, is because his books translate well to being adapted into movies. Like, you know, think about a lot of Philip K. Dick books and stories, or at least think about the movies that have been adapted from his books. You know, they're always about everyman characters who are just trying to figure out what the hell's going on. You know, that's the whole plot of Total Recall. I'm just trying to figure out what's going on. I've got to get to Mars. Or you know, the Adjustment Bureau from back around, like, 2011. It was about a guy who something weird happens, and he spends the whole rest of the movie trying to figure out what's going on. Like, you know, these kinds of stories make great movies. It's easy to adapt, and I don't think that anyone is ever going to make a movie out of Stand on Zanzibar or Brian Aldiss's Helicona Spring, which, like, he it's this trilogy of books that he wrote: Helicona Spring, Helicona Summer, Helicona Winter, and they're, like, these huge, thick books that I haven't read them, but they're about, it's like a planet whose weather, the climate shifts, like, over thousands of years. Like, it's one of those, like, really big time scale kind of books. So I imagine pretty hard to adapt. Right, but so anyway, the adaptability of Philip K. Dick's books, like, I don't think many people really think about that. Like, why is that a reason why he's remembered? But that's a big reason.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Or why hasn't Ursula Le Guin been adapted that much? I mean,
Yeah.
I think part of that might be just some of the political content of her work.
Yeah, I imagine. Although,
I know they tried to do an Earthsea series, but
yeah,
I don't know.
I don't know too much about that. I mean, we might see more of that. Well, actually, I heard that we're supposed to be getting an Earthsea adaptation that, might actually do her work some justice. I forget where I heard that, but I have a feeling that's true.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, I seem to recall that someone tried to do an adaptation of it, but the cast was overwhelmingly white, and she got really mad.
Oh, yeah. Well, that would be something to get mad about for Earthsea.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, some novels are super hard to adapt. Like, I know they did adapt Dune,
Yeah, a couple of
but
times.
audiences, I mean, Dune, as directed by David Lynch, audiences were not ready for that. Audiences were just, they couldn't. It was too much, which I kind of respect doing. Like, let's take this totally bonkers novel and have the most bonkers director do it.
Yeah, or well, I think they adapted it again in the 2000s on sci-fi.
Right. And I think they're going to try and do it again. Like, you
Yeah,
guys,
I heard that.
how many fiascos are you going to make? I mean, I'm all here for it. If they do something completely bonkers again, I will be very excited. But I
Yeah,
think honestly, the worst idea would be like to try and play it safe and make something normal and easy to understand. Because, like, man, that's not Dune.
yeah.
It's not Dune if you fully understand what's happening ever. If you're not looking at it the whole time going, what the fuck? Then it's not truly a Dune experience, I think.
Yeah, but yeah, they're just all these different forces that can have an impact on your career that have very little to do with. I mean, even if it relates somewhat to the work, it that have very little to do with the quality of the work. Like how you said with trilogies, I was reading a forward to a book of science fiction author profiles by Charles Platt, and he was talking in the foreword. I don't know how accurate exactly that his reading of it is, but I mean he was there at the time on the scene, and one of the things that he said was that after Star Wars became a big hit, and around the same time, like the Lord of the Rings really took off. So all of this anti-science space fantasy and big fat heroic fantasy and trilogies became a big deal in the 80s. And he said that there were a lot of great science fiction writers who had pretty, for the time, pretty good careers in the 70s who just couldn't really manage to make the shift from writing well thought out, I guess you could say rigorous standalone science fiction novels to, writing epic fantasy series or things like that. And as a result, their careers suffered or they ended altogether. Like Bob Silverberg, again, I'm bringing it up, but I think it's known. It was known at the time that his big return to writing in the 80s, his Madripoor books, like within the industry, like I think anyway, it's tough to talk about because it's not like I was there, but I've heard that like
Right.
people knew that it was like kind of a cash grab because I mean I think they were pretty good books. I mean he's Bob Silverberg, but it was definitely a change from what he had written. He had that great 10-year period from like 65 to 75 where he was writing some of the best and well respected science fiction of the day, and they were like slim one-shot novels that dealt with all these heady concepts. And I think Madripoor is it's a secondary world set on another planet with kind of like a semi-medieval setting, which isn't to say, I mean, not in the same way that like Game of Thrones is semi-medieval, but so he made the switch, and a lot of I guess a lot of other writers couldn't. I just never really thought about it that way before. I feel like people don't really think too often about, like, why did one writer succeed? Why did another writer stop writing? Who managed to hang around for decades? There's just a lot more that goes into it besides the work.
Absolutely. And so much of it is kind of chaotic and unpredictable, and
yeah.
And some of it, and sometimes it's inexplicable. Like, why? A lot of times you'll find movies that weren't popular at the time but became huge cult hits, and movies that were popular at the time but, like, no one remembers. Like, everybody, like, I believe Fight Club wasn't popular at the time, but it became this huge cultural institution. And meanwhile, no one who saw Avatar even remembers it.
I know, right? And it was...
Like, it made $1 zillion. Yeah. Millions of people saw it, but if you ask anyone to describe what happens, they'll say, oh, yeah. Like, every time I'm reminded of Avatar, I go, oh, yeah, I remember that. That happened.
Yeah, you can never tell.
That huge $1 zillion thing happened. It never enters my mind, usually, unprompted.
Yeah, you can just never tell. But I guess that was all. I think that was all I had to say about market forces.
Right. It's strange, and I'm wondering, like, is it worth it for a writer to try to consider that while writing? I mean, financially or creatively, or, like, do you stick to your guns? Do you risk losing your career? Do you risk getting kind of ossified? Like, a lot of older writers who don't change. That's not always great, creatively you end up just becoming a fossil in some ways if you don't change at all. So, I mean, how do you make that decision as a writer? Do you just keep doing the same thing? Do you try to chase the way the culture changes? Or do you just sort of let things happen organically?
I think that most writers, whether they realize it or not, try to write for what the economic realities are of the market. Like, going back to trilogies again, I'm sure, maybe there are a lot of writers out there who, maybe they would have let that book be a standalone book without padding it out into a trilogy, but that's what'll sell, so that's what you do. Or nowadays with Tor.com, they seem to have a fairly good thing going with their novella program that they're publishing, and
right, novellas were kind of dead for a while.
Yeah,
almost.
Well, I mean, the magazines always publish them, but just as standalone things, yeah, it's not like you could really go to the bookstore and find a book that was 120 pages long. I mean, where was that going to be? But now there's a lot more than they used to be, and I'm sure there are a lot of short story writers who write science fiction in the field, and now Tor.com is available for novellas. And actually, recently at the magazine, we get review books in from publishers, so we log them in and we send them out to our book reviewers. And we're starting to see drips and drabs here and there. I've seen a couple of standalone novellas come in that were published by Harper Voyager. So, I guess the other genre publishers are starting to look at what Tor is doing with novellas, and they're thinking, well, hey, if they're doing it, maybe we can too. So I think, there must be a lot of short story writers out there who, maybe 10 years ago, like, they'd try and write a novella if they felt like the story they were trying to tell was a novella, and, well, maybe I can sell it to FNSF or Analog or Asimov's, right? But now that Tor.com is here, maybe they're thinking, like, I'm going to write a novella. Or maybe now you're thinking, like, well, this story's like 12,000 words. I could probably expand it up to like 30,000 or so, and maybe I can get it published by Tor.com as a novella. So, writers aren't stupid. It just depends on whatever the market is asking for. And I think most people try to write for that market. I mean, whether they're really thinking about what they're doing or not.
Yeah. Consciously or unconsciously, you kind of get aware of stuff. And I'm sure that if you are writing for a living too, and it's not just an extra side gig or something, that is a thing you kind of have to be conscious of.
Yeah. I mean, you can think about, the singular vision of, somebody like J.R.R. Tolkien, But, let's not forget, those books were his hobby. He was an Oxford professor. He didn't
Right.
have to worry about how many years he was taking to write Lord of the Rings.
Right.
I mean,
And a
yeah.
lot of the greats, a lot of the writers that we think of as these greats absolutely made ways to maximize the amount of money they made. Like I believe Alexandre Dumas was paid by the line. So in The Count of Monte Cristo, there's a character who can only communicate by blinking yes or no.
Uh,
And it's a way to just extend these chapters into way, way, way more lines than they normally would be. So he just found a way to just fill his wallet by having this guy blink for like chapters and chapters. It's brilliant. Like
yeah.
once you find that out, you realize exactly why the character exists. And it's like, oh my God, you son of a bitch. That's brilliant.
Yeah, or even something like I've heard that novels started getting fatter in the 90s because publishers like they finally figured out a way for the printing presses to so they could just bind bigger books than they used to be able to.
And that's it. What would usually be like two books is just like, oh, I'm just gonna put one.
Yeah, yeah, or
Sort of.
like a story or like a novel. But if you look at like paperback novels from like from several decades, but let's just say, late 60s, mid 70s, if you look at like a lot of those paperback SF novels, they all tend to be around like they all around the same page count. Like a lot of the times it's like 256 pages, for
Yeah,
example.
they're pretty slim.
Yeah, yeah, and that's a printing thing.
Huh.
Well, that's why you get how when you read a hardcover book or a trade paperback or something like that, and some of the times the book has a lot of blank pages at the end.
Right.
Right. Yeah, that's a printing press thing. How they print the book because the book pages are all like printed out on like a huge sheet of paper and they're not in order at all, but then when the machines like they take the huge piece of paper and they fold it down into I think sixteenths and then that's what they like glue together with the book. So you can't print like that process is going to have like a set number of
I
pages, and
see.
if you want
Yeah.
it to be shorter or longer, it's going to be longer by a certain amount or shorter by a certain amount. So that's why you get all those weird end papers sometimes in books. And so I guess that's what I'm saying about all those books from the 70s. Like they tended to be around the same length because there were just more mechanical restrictions
Yeah.
on books. I mean, that's how our magazine is printed today. It's always 260 pages, including the front and back cover. And the few times that we have made bigger issues, those are, I think, like 320 pages. But like it has to be, I forget the exact number, but it has to be specifically that number because that's how the printing press works.
Huh.
Yeah.
I did not know that.
Yep.
That's kind of neat.
Yep. Neat things.
And then in the 80s, I guess they changed that and we could get a new 800-page book from Stephen King
Well,
every month.
it's funny you bring him up, but I think if I remember my reading correctly, that is the reason that the original version of The Stand is about 800 pages, and then the original and uncut edition of The Stand is like about 1,200 pages.
Good God.
Yeah, because his publisher at the time was Doubleday Books, and they had their own printing presses, and they didn't think that they could print a book that big and sell it at the price point that they thought that it would need to be set at if it was gonna, like make sense for how big the book is. So, they told
Right.
him and his either his agent or his editor at Doubleday, but they told him like, hey, either you can cut a third of this book out or we will, because we're only going to publish
Oh,
up to an 800-page book. We're just not set up to do anything else. Yeah.
right. Wow. Cutting out a third of your book. Jesus
Yeah.
Christ. That's got to be tough.
I can't imagine.
Yeah. Oh, gosh. So I think we've gone on long enough. Oh my God, it's been like 2 hours. And the cats are starting to attack me and demand treats, so it might be a good time to start closing down. But before we go, is there anything you would like to promote?
Me that I would like to promote? No, I don't really have much going on. I guess all I'll say is just to give a few reading recommendations, things that I like that I think are great. My only official plug is just the magazine of fantasy and science fiction. You can find us in the magazine rack at Barnes & Noble and Books A Million, or you can find us online. Just type in the magazine of fantasy and science fiction.com. The website will pop up. It's old, but it works. We have, of course, our paper edition, which I like best, but we have a Kindle edition, and we also have an electronic edition for non-Kindle that is put out through weightless books. Weight as in books that are not heavy. So weightless books if you're into electronic. I already talked about We Who Are About To. If people want to read anything by Mary Rickert, she's a short story writer, and I think she has one novel out. Her work is great. Anybody who is into like eco science fiction, you can't go wrong with Paolo Bacigalupi. Gene Wolfe, great writer. Catherine Valenti, I've only read her short story, The Future is Blue, but that was really cool. Staked out what I thought was a real hard position about, I guess you could say nihilism, but the protagonist of the story didn't see it that way. But so that was a cool story. Also, if anybody likes Ken Liu's work, personally,
he's awesome.
Personally, I think that his best story was a novelette called Arc that ran in the September-October 2012 issue of FNSF, and or maybe it might be included in his forthcoming second collection. I don't know what the table of contents is. I know that everybody likes to talk about Paper Menagerie, which we also published, and that is also a great story. I just happen to think that Arc is even better. Really Class A work, and I feel like it didn't get as much attention. And if you like to read old SF, both for its own sake and also to marvel at, wow, I can't believe those people thought those things back then. My boss edited an anthology of repopulation science fiction stories from the 50s and 60s called Go Forth and Multiply. It came out from a small press, but I mean that's what it is. It's stories from that old trope that used to be so prevalent back then of we crash landed on a planet, or a virus wiped out almost everybody, for example, and now there's just a few of us left, and we've got to get down to repopulating the species. Oh boy. I mean, some of them are actually still, there are a couple in there that are still pretty good stories just for their own, like just as stories, and the other ones are interesting pieces. Like I said, the past is a whole different world, and that can that can be both, it can be both tough to read sometime, but it's also interesting to read. A truly what is sometimes a truly alien outlook, and in science fiction, aliens are a big thing.
Right. The past is a different country, as they say.
So yeah, I'm rambling. So just read the magazine. Why don't you? I think it's cool.
Yeah, read the magazine. Buy the magazine. Okay, good. That's all for this episode. If you like what you heard, head on over to patreon.com/Rite Gud, that's RITEGUD, and subscribe. Patrons get exclusive content, like episodes on Cabaret, The Dark Crystal, and Franz Kafka, as well as the ability to start fires with your mind. And be sure to join us next time when we talk about the perils of fandom. And until then, keep writing good.
This has been Rite Gud with R.S. Benedict, hosted by R.S. Benedict and produced by Matt Keeley for KS Media LLC. This has been a Kitty Sneezes production. For comments and concerns, please write to us at ritegud@kittysneezes.com. That's RITEGUD @kittysneezes.com. If you'd like to support us, please visit our Patreon at patreon.com/ritegud.
kittysneezes.com in color.